Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar this morning, sponsored by Sistra on Transport Futures, What's Next for Active Travel. I'm Catherine Jones. I'm a Projects Director at Sistra. I have stepped in at the last minute to chair this webinar as one of my colleagues unfortunately is off sick today. So I'm not necessarily an expert in active travel, but I'm very interested to hear what our speakers have to say today. And I expect there to be some lively discussion about the presentations and the themes that we're covering today about active travel. I'd like to introduce the speakers that we have today. We're going to start with Peter Edwards, Transport Planning Associate for Sistra. Then we're going to move on to Tom Cohen, who's a Reader in Transport Policy at the University of Westminster. And then we're going to be joined by Mariam Dreyer, who's the Chief Exec of Joyriders, with a really interesting presentation. And finally, we'll be joined by Steve Essex, who's a partner with Transport Initiatives. So I think this hopefully will be very thought-provoking, and there are some interesting concepts that we're going to talk about. So just a little bit of housekeeping, please. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Please put questions into the Q&A. We'll only be picking questions up from there. Normally with these webinars, there's quite a lot of questions that come in, and that helps us sift through them. If you want to have a chat, as Juliana just has, then by all means use the chat, but we won't be picking up themes from there to discuss. Each of the speakers will be talking for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to open the floor up to Q&A. So we'll pick out the questions that come through on the Q&A. We've had some that have been sent in previously as well. So we'll have plenty of time at the end of the presentations for some lively discussion. Thanks. If I can now introduce Peter to come forward with his presentation. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Catherine. Yeah, my name's Peter Edwards, Associate Transport Planner at Sistra, primarily working on active travel projects across the country. And I'm going to be talking today about a kind of a future scenario with active travel kind of at the centre of a kind of a positive outlook on how we might get to a community and a country where active travel is at the forefront of what we're doing. And is a big change and a radical change as to how we're currently planning our transport systems and our cities and our communities. So I'm going to talk through kind of where we are now. I won't spend too much time on that because I know that there's kind of preaching to the choir a little bit here. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Mark. Yeah, so kind of presenting the case for change, why we need to have this radical change. I've used the term utopian vision for the future, which, yeah, sounds a little kind of unrealistic and kind of perhaps too optimistic, but I think it is achievable, how we might get to that point. And the role active travel play within that. I'm going to use the term active travel rather than walking, wheeling and cycling throughout the presentations. Is less of a mouthful, so apologies for the kind of the jargon. And then, yeah, talk a little bit about how we might get there. So in terms of where we are now and the case for change, as I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. There's some, if we just move on, yeah, there's some quite shocking statistics on the slide. We probably, as transport professionals and people dialing into a webinar of this nature, we know these issues. We know that congestion is causing billions and billions of pounds a year worth of issues to our country. It's not just the economy that this is impacting, but it's health, well-being, and productivity. We know that people can't get to where they want to go, to their jobs, to other destinations because they're too reliant on our whole transport system is too reliant on private motor vehicles, and that's a result of kind of 50 plus years of kind of car-centric planning that's led to us kind of having issues around inactivity, air quality and congestion. So I think it's important to say that there are kind of more positive noises coming out of government in terms of trying to link active travel to health and productivity. I think the narrative in the last certainly since I've been involved in the field the last 10 plus years, where it's kind of been, we need to do this, walking and cycling is the right thing to do. It hasn't really cut through necessarily and isn't really landing. So I think the fact that the DFT, Active Travel England, we're now focusing this more on health and productivity. I know lots of clients that I'm working with, especially, are really trying to push that angle, that this isn't the narrative of you should leave your car at home because it's the right thing to do, hasn't really worked. But we do need to kind of change that narrative and to start really pushing the fact that this over reliance on private motor vehicles and the current system that we have in place is not working, and we do need radical change. Hence the kind of nature of this presentation and the kind of looking forward into a kind of future scenario. So on my next slide, given this is a future scenario, a looking forward webinar, I've had to delve into using AI. I thought it was appropriate. I have to admit I haven't delved much into AI. I'm probably a little bit behind the curve on this. But what I wanted to do with this image is I went onto an AI image creator and said, please, can you provide me with a utopian vision of a transport network in the future in an urban environment. I gave it a few prompts, but not a huge amount. And as I say, I'm not very good with AI yet, so I don't think I gave it that much prompting. But what I thought was interesting was, and it's far from perfect, but I think what was interesting, that I didn't prompt it to not put any cars, any private vehicles in it. I think there's one just peeping out at the bottom of the image. But what it's presented, there is the thing that jumped out to me was that there was a lack of private vehicles on there. There was lots of public transport, and there was lots of people walking and cycling. The cycling provision probably isn't particularly great, but I wasn't going to spend too much time refining it. I wanted it just to kind of give me a kind of a pushed out image. And what I think is striking is the kind of the wide pavements, the green. And I think everyone could get behind a kind of future scenario like this for our cities and our towns, where we're not looking at 5 lanes of clogged up motor vehicles and all the issues that poses that I've already touched upon. I think if you were really being picky, you'd be looking for some better cycling infrastructure on here, some places, some more public realm, and some places for people to kind of sit and rest. But I thought it was just an interesting exercise, given the framing of this webinar and of my presentation, to give AI. Yes, it's a very good point from the chat. Looked hard for pedestrians to cross. I didn't claim it was perfect, but I just thought it was an interesting exercise. So moving on. Talking about this utopian future scenario, how do we get there? How do we get to a point in 2050 where we have this utopian vision of transport, where active travel is playing a key role? And I think the main way we get there is with an integrated approach to planning. This isn't going to be solved by the Department for Transport or one single department within government, nor within local authorities. It won't sit purely with the transport planning team in a local authority. This needs a much more holistic approach. And my colleague Andrew Archer will be presenting next week at the main kind of Future 50 conference on this kind of a future scenario. And I've read his article, which will be released in the run up to the conference next week. And he's talking about something called a Ministry of Place, which I think is a really interesting concept, and I think is something that would actually be required in order to get us to this kind of utopian vision, where rather than a department for transport and a department for planning and air quality, etc., that we have this overarching Ministry of Place that is overseeing the kind of development of our towns, cities and communities, and is making some pretty difficult decisions about what does and doesn't get built, how we plan our cities and neighbourhoods, and how that could potentially lead to a nicer and more sustainable future, given where we are with climate change and all the kind of negative stuff that I've outlined earlier in the presentation. So I kind of wanted to riff on that a little bit in terms of a kind of utopian scenario for the future. I've used the dreaded term there of kind of 15-minute neighbourhoods, which has obviously become kind of a buzzword within the kind of culture wars related to active travel, but I think in its purest sense, that's the only way that we're going to get to more healthier, sustainable neighborhoods where we're putting the facilities and the amenities that people want to go to right in the heart of those communities. And the only way to do and that in turn will lead to people obviously needing to travel a little bit less, and actually walking and cycling becoming the most, and wheeling, apologies for the omission there, of how walking and cycling become the first choice of how to get there, so you don't just hop in your car because everything is on your doorstep. And for those longer journeys, you're linked into to public transport that works, and you create a hierarchy. And I know we already have this hierarchy in place, but I think in reality, I think we'd all agree that the way things are planned in the transport field at the moment, we say we have this walking and cycling at the top of the hierarchy, but I don't think it's necessarily the case. So I think you need this kind of ministry of place concept, which is planning our communities with everything on your doorstep, so you can walk and cycle. So you don't need to have the kind of siloed approach to kind of transport planning that we have at the moment, where we're looking at, we need a cycle lane here. We need to actually just take a kind of more holistic approach, looking from the top down at how we actually reduce the need to travel and put stuff on people's doorstep, and creating that hierarchy that just feels natural. That like you step out of your door and you can go to a leisure centre, you can go to a place of work, you can go to the shops, etc., and you can get there by foot or by bicycle. So yeah, that's the kind of utopian future scenario we're talking about. I think it's obviously slightly radical and will require some changes to get to. But on the next slide, kind of looking at the role active travel potentially play within that. As I say, I think it needs to be front and center, and it needs to be the natural choice, and it needs to be made easy. I know I've kind of borrowed this this image, or this, at least this style of image, from a Chris Boardman presentation, where he literally has one slide, presents a picture of some teenagers, I presume in Holland, traveling independently, and says, well, this is where we need to get to. So I'm trying to get to that, really, in terms of giving people independence to travel from the age 8 to 80 upwards. So we have a safe, attractive and accessible network on your doorstep. There's no point in having fantastic cycle superhighways along main roads if you can't get to them. So we need that connectivity within our neighbourhoods, and then that wider connectivity into the wider towns and cities that we live in, with transport hubs, shared mobility, helping to remove some of those barriers to people getting to active travel. And I think importantly, and I'm sure Mariam's going to touch on this, so I won't spend too much time on it, actually accompanying that infrastructure with revenue activity, with behaviour change activity that further removes those barriers and helps people to get out walking and cycling. I think for my final slide, it's kind of a call to action, really, in terms of how do we get there. Some of the stuff I've described is quite radical and feels quite a long way off, and it will require strong political will and leadership to get to this point of this kind of utopian vision that we've described. That integrated approach to planning, that's a deliberate repetition on my slides, because without that, you're not going to get there. There's a role for technology here in terms of shared mobility and making that integration of transport easier for people, making it more convenient so that you can jump on a hire bike or a scooter. You can get yourself onto a bus or a tram or a train. And some longer term planning, and I don't think we're particularly good at that necessarily. If we're talking about a future scenario for 2050, this needs to start now. It can't be something that we ponder over for the next 5-10 years and then wonder how we're not quite getting there. And I think there will be I know there will be a need for some stick as well as carrot here. It's not, you can't just purely ask people nicely. There's going to need to be some difficult decisions to make this stuff happen. But I don't think it's unrealistic. If you look abroad, the Dutch, for example, they started building these networks and changing the way that they plan their neighborhoods and their transport networks 20, 25, 30 years ago. We haven't quite got there yet. So we need to start looking abroad for some inspiration and start moving now. And Catherine's just come on screen, so that means I've I'm out of time. But that is my last slide, Catherine. So I think I just almost ran to time.
That's great, Peter. Thank you very much. Yes, you did almost run to time. Um, so that's a really good introduction, I think, to the areas we're talking about today in terms of, making active travel a kind of, holistic part of the way that we all live and work and access leisure and shopping and things like that. So I'm going to introduce Tom Cohen now, who's from the University of Westminster, to present on this a little further. Thanks very much, Tom.
Thanks, Catherine. Hello, everyone. It's nice to be with you, in cyberspace. As my opening slide says, I am from the University of Westminster. Thanks, Mark. So just to go into that a little bit more detail, I work at the University of Westminster, where we offer a range of attractive and high-quality transport courses. Check us out. Space is still available for our masters starting in the autumn. We're also the Active Travel Academy. I'm part of that. And for those who don't know us, we're a research and knowledge exchange body. We do a lot of work on all things active travel, and we're also very interested in sharing our findings with the practitioner and the activist community. So do sign up if you aren't already part of our mailing list. I'll put a link into the chat at the end. And in fact, I've gone so far as to introduce what I understand is a QR code on my final slide. So those of you who are into such things can take a shot of that. Thanks, Mark. So the Ministry of Place made me slightly nervous. I generally think of myself as being something of a technocrat, but at the same time, when we remove silos, when we start centralizing, I suddenly come over all Brazil, and the film fans amongst you will recognize this image from the Ministry of Information. Without wanting to overdo it, I am slightly nervous of this idea that we can, through centralized planning, solve all of our problems. But let's hope I'm wrong, and let's go with it for a little bit. Thanks, Mark. So this is an image from the innocent times of 2019. Do you remember? We hadn't started fighting over LTNs. We didn't even know about the pandemic. We were just completely overwrought with Brexit. And at that time, Sustrans produced a manifesto for the coming general election. They said, imagine living in a place where everything you need is within a 20-minute walk. And I think you'll agree that the image is quite appealing. It's not unlike the one which Peter showed us a short time ago, perhaps even more cuddly and Larry-esque in terms of creating that sense of an environment in which you would like to spend time. And again, there is an almost complete absence of private vehicles and a lot of other things going on. It's all really very nice, isn't it? Thanks, Mark. But it's nothing new. Let's go back a further 50 years to Milton Keynes, which is every planner's favorite punch bag. This is from the original plans for the city, and I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. So you can see the road grid as it was set out, but if you look closely, you'll also see little black squares. And according to the key, those are local activity centres. And that requires a little bit of further description. So onward, please, Mark. So in the same article, the architects who came up with this idea are explaining how it's going to work. So the local activity centres will sit in each of the cells, and people will be able to take advantage of the facilities immediately available to them. But the good news is, as you can see from item F, members of a family living in one residential area will use different facilities in different areas. So you can put your pitchforks away. This isn't going to be locking people into their cells. Nevertheless, the expectation is that people have on their doorstep all of the things they need. So putting it another way, Milton Keynes was an attempt at a 20 or 15-minute city. The number doesn't matter terribly much, but Milton Keynes was conceived as being a place in which people would be able to get what they needed without having to travel by car. All of which sounds quite appealing. Thanks, Mark. And here is an example of it. This is Netherfield, one of the centres, of which there are many. And if you look closely, you can see that the word Netherfield is actually written out on the columns, which is rather pleasing. You can see also the cars parked up, which perhaps tells the slightly more truthful story about Milton Keynes. But this was all part of the futurist vision of the city, and there's quite a lot to recommend it. Thanks, Mark. The active travel enthusiasts will also know that Milton Keynes is pretty well provided for in terms of active travel infrastructure. There is the network of redways, some of which are really great, some of which are a little on the wiggly side, we could criticize for personal safety. And I suppose the biggest downside is that a lot of them run alongside the major roads, so they're not especially pleasant to use. But in terms of density and permeability, it's pretty good. And as we look into it in more detail, thanks, Mark. This is from an earlier version of the map. It was, I suppose, on paper, at least in principle. And we're back in Netherfield, and I just wanted to draw your attention to the specifics. So I've picked out the local activity centre, which is towards the top there. We'll look at that a little bit more in a second. And there's also in each of these areas a so-called meeting place. So this really was a planned environment in a slightly draconian, maybe not excessively so, but a slightly draconian model of living, where the expectation was that people would come together, would socialize together amongst their communities. And the meeting place is indeed a kind of community hall in this case, and others are similar. But if we now look at the centre in a little bit more detail. Thanks, Mark. So type may be a little small, but I'll pick a few things out for you. This is the local activity centre we saw a moment ago, that picture of cars parked outside. And there's quite a lot here, actually. You've got a pharmacist, you've got a couple of food shops, there's plenty of fast food, there's a hairdresser, and I'm pleased to see there's also drug addiction support. So frankly, everything you could possibly need in order to have a full and rewarding life. But if we go on, thanks, Mark. We have to ask ourselves why it is that despite all this, the mode share for active travel in Milton Keynes remains frankly pitiful. Well, the answer is right in front of us, which is that you can plan these environments, you can create the circumstances in which people have everything that they need on their doorstep, and yet they might still choose to drive, and that's what happens in Milton Keynes. And why? Well, it's fairly obvious, as in you can see there is a dense grid of high capacity, high speed, dual carriageways. We could also talk about the way in which land use has been planned in Milton Keynes, which doesn't help. But if we simply concentrate for a moment on the highway network, I think it tells us all we need to know. Despite everything that was envisaged in 1969 by the designers, what we have is an environment in which we are being told in very clear terms that driving is the right thing to do. The driving is the sensible thing to do. And sure enough, if you get in your car, you will have more options available to you than the few shops in your Netherfield local activity centre. You can go to a bigger shop with more ranges, more options, and so on. So that, I think, is where I get to, which is that we can plan all we like for 15 or 20-minute cities, but we probably need to do extra. And this is where I probably come round to agreeing with Peter. So thanks, Mark. And we're back with Brazil. So I would say that where I will be on the side of the technocrats is in the overwhelming need for car constraint. It's all very well making environments which are conducive to active travel, but we absolutely have to grapple with the car. And that's not simply because if we don't, people will continue to drive, but also because if we don't, active travel will continue to be relatively unattractive, simply because we're creating spaces in which cars create danger and an inhospitable space in which people are expected to move about their business. So my closing slide is simply my details. And as I warned you, a QR code for those who are so inclined. I look forward to the conversation that we'll be having. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Tom. It's interesting that and the discussion we can maybe have later about, cart for horse, do we get rid of the cars first? Do we get the centres there first? It's a very difficult decision and a very difficult thing to actually make happen. But hopefully we can discuss that a little bit more. And now I'd like to introduce Mariam Dreyer from Joyriders, who's got a great presentation to share with us. Thanks very much, Mariam.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Yeah, I've actually been to Milton Keynes and have a very unpleasant memory of a bike ride there, just to start off with. So it's not that great always. So I'm from Joyriders. Joyriders is a community group that started out in 2016 in Waltham Forest, alongside what is now known as Mini Holland and their various LTNs and cycle schemes. So I think that played a part in why we could start up quite easily there with a lot of support from the local council. And we're now focusing on getting people from low income and ethnic minority communities into cycling and trying to take them up cycling as active travel. So as you can see on the next slide, local neighborhoods are very important to us and they play a big role in getting people to cycle. But what is often forgotten that you don't just, if you just build it, it doesn't mean that people will come. Some people will come, but not all people. So what we have to take into consideration when we start building new neighborhoods is that it has to feel inclusive and it has to feel welcoming. One size doesn't always fit all. And infrastructure and active travel schemes must cater to diverse needs. That includes people who until now only have driven in their car because they feel that's the best way to get around, people with multiple children, people who are on low incomes, people with disabilities. Everyone should feel that they can get around easily in their local neighborhood and beyond as well. Thank you, Mark. So to get there, what we have to do is to listen to people and we have to listen to their needs. From experience, those communities who have the biggest needs, they're often the least likely to speak up. So we really have to put more effort into reaching out to communities, talking to them, understanding their barriers and try to accommodate to their needs. At Joyriders at the moment, this means, for example, adapting the way we run training, and this might be different in different locations. So what works in Southwark doesn't work in Camden and the other way around. We have to put activities on at times where it suits the people we work with, and we are providing all the kit that people need to start cycling. So bikes, helmets, and any other thing which is needed is provided from our side to get them up to skills. And then we signpost as well to other organizations who can help them further, like from where to get a low-cost bike. Thank you, Mark. So what are the challenges in overlooked communities? I think there's something missing on this slide. Oh, it's coming up. So low-income, ethnic, minority, and immigrant communities often feel already overlooked and pushed aside, not just in active travel conversations, but also when it comes to other things. When we put on consultations or we have workshops, which is often put up by local authorities, these are not the people who attend, so we have to go to them and we have to start talking to them. We also have to take into account any language barriers that might exist and try to get ways to communicate with people. There are a lot of other barriers and they can be quite varied, but some of the most common barriers is, of course, financial pressure. They're often on very low incomes, so even maintaining a car is difficult for them, but they still do it because a car is kind of a status symbol. Lack of cycling skills or confidence, it's very high up on the list as well. Often people never learn to cycle, or even if they did, they might cycle a bit in childhood and never since, and they haven't had the opportunity to take up cycling again. I think also here bikeability comes a bit in, which is the schemes we run in schools, but often the children from these communities are not able to take part in bikeability because they are not skilled enough to take part. You often have to already be able to cycle to a certain level to actually be chosen to be a part of this. And very few schools actually run sessions for children who can't cycle yet. Storage challenges, it's very high up. So a lot of these families have housing issues. They live in very small housing, have multiple children, and storing bikes is definitely a challenge and often just not possible. I know we now have fantastic storage schemes with the cycle hubs and they're great. But for example, where I live, you only get one space per household, which just isn't good enough. And there aren't enough around to accommodate everyone who wants one. There are long waiting lists. And then there's the cultural perception. So people often think that cycling is something to be looked down upon at times. In some cultures, women are not supposed to cycle because it doesn't fit the norm, or it's considered non-appropriate. And the car is king, and the car is a status symbol. And I would also like to point out that these communities are less concerned with environmental challenges. That's often seen as something very middle class. And I think we've got to have that talk about, class systems which are still in place in the UK, that there certainly is a difference between different communities, how things are perceived and looked upon. Thank you, Mark. So our approach is a little bit different. We're doing a lot of targeted outreach rather than just putting up things online, which we do, of course. We also go into communities, we talk to them. We try to have instructors on our sessions who speak different languages at times, if possible. And we're trying to be very sensitive when it comes to training culturally when we support people. So, for example, we are quite open about that. You don't have to wear lycra. It's not needed. There's no specific clothing you need to wear or anything. You can come as you are and you will be able to learn how to ride a bike. We also try to work in partnerships with local organizations who are non-cycling organizations, so that that helps us with outreach, and it's really good to build up trust with local communities if we don't work with them already. Our goal is to normalize cycling as an everyday accessible and affordable travel option. We really want to push towards active travel and not just leisure or sports. I think that's another challenge the UK faces. The perception of cycling as being a sport in many communities still and in many areas, and the idea that you have to wear certain clothing, or even if you cycle to work, that you have to change at work and take a shower. This is something I've never experienced when I lived in the Netherlands or in Germany. But people just get on their bike and they cycle to work, and it's so much more relaxed. No one thinks about things like, oh, I have to take a shower at work, or I have to change my clothes, all the things. And that's definitely another barrier that exists. Thank you, Mark. I wanted to introduce you all to Gertrude. Gertrude never had the opportunity to learn to cycle as a child. She lives in Deptford. She works in Southwark in Elephant and Castle. She is a hairdresser and got her own salon there. And she used to drive every day to work, although she never really liked it. When Gertrude heard about the Women's Only Learn to Ride cycle sessions we were holding in Burgess Park, she joined us and she learned to ride a bike. It took her a while, and that's fine. And now Gertrude has a bike. She bought herself a bike and she cycles to work almost every day now. And she gets upset if she don't get to cycle to work. So I think she's a really great example how cycle sessions and how mode shift activation can change people's lives and can take people with us who otherwise maybe would have been left out because they've never been taught those skills. And it's really hard, especially when you're a little bit older, to learn how to cycle by yourselves, because it's not just pedaling on a bike, it's also being comfortable cycling in your local communities in whatever environment you have. There's different road spaces, different spaces. So that's really important that people are comfortable with that one as well. So it's not just about learning to ride a bike, it's about learning to ride a bike in your area. Another example where I don't have a photo is Takia. She came along on one of our social rides, which is run by our volunteers. And when she came on her first ride, she didn't know how to cycle. She lied to us and told us she can. And for whatever reason, she managed to come on that ride, and she learned how to ride a bike on that day. That was about 3 years ago. She's now one of our volunteer ride leaders, and she cycled London to Brighton. She is now, she's got 2 bikes now. She lives in Westminster in social housing, so she has very little space, but she made sure to have space for her bikes. She also wears a niqab, so she is fully covered, and she is well known in her local community now as the woman on the green bike. She got also inspired to start running, and she ran the London Marathon last year, and she is learning to swim at the moment. So again, it shows how we can take those communities with us if we put a little bit effort and time into it. Thank you, Mark. And that's the next point. So how can we support communities? Because they are the least likely to speak up and come forward. We don't hear their voices. So we really have to proactively reach out and create spaces for them to be heard. If we don't do that, and we see that already in places where we have a lot of infrastructure in place, it creates a lot of resentment. People just feel overlooked and not being part of the community. They didn't feel part of it in the first place, but when we make driving more difficult, which we should, and we've put more barriers towards driving, if we don't create the options to take up alternatives, it creates resentment and anger. And that's what we see, for example, in Waltham Forest, where we don't put enough effort into taking those communities with us. So we need to really make sure that we support them. That could be providing bike storage better than what we do at the moment. So really cycling hubs, cycle storage near homes. I know when we've built new housing, which is often car-free, cycle storage is built in, but we also need to see what we can do with older housing stock, because we can't just abandon all the housing stock and build new. That would be great, but we've got to see how we can retrofit cycle storage into these housings. Access to cargo bikes is really important. A lot of the families we work with, they have 2 or 3, even more children who often are quite young. And if we want people to take up cycling as a real alternative, we have to provide them with bikes where you can actually manage that with children. And cargo bikes are often the only solution. But access is very expensive. So we need to have schemes in place where they become affordable. Cycle lessons, cycle trainings for people who just don't have those skills, very important. And I think when we fix it for those communities, if we make it work for them, then it really can work for everyone. Thank you, Mark. And that was my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Mariam. That was a really inspiring presentation. And, you know, that you're right. I think that your final statement really summed it up. If you can make it work for these communities, it can work for everybody. But you've still got to take people on that journey. Thank you very much. Can I now introduce Steve Essex, who's from Transport Initiatives, for the final presentation. Thanks, Steve.
Hello. So I thought I'd look at rural areas because there's rumoured to be some guidance coming out from Active Travel England, and my brain has been focused on this. So if we move on. So this clearly is a deep rural area. But what's quite interesting is that different people have different ideas of what is a rural area and what isn't. Next, please. So if you look up the ONS, you will find a definition of what is a rural area. So normally that's settlements with less than 10,000 people. And of those 10 categories in the list there, rural is the top 6, or deep rural. That's what I would like to look at, Mark. So I'd like to look at these 4 things, the deep rural areas, because clearly, if we can get it right there, we can get it right for bigger places. So if we move on, we are now in a place where we have a new government, 25 years' time, which is apparently doing totally wonderful things for active travel and people. So it's that Ministry of Place that Peter was talking about. But not everybody likes it. But some other papers do, Mark. So the another more left-wing paper has observed that the new government is 25 years too late. So the point is that if we want to achieve good things in 2050, we should really be starting to do it now. Next, please. So we actually have an awful lot to do. So you've seen diagrams very much like this, which show that emissions have to fall. And as part of that, transport emissions have to fall too. Next, Mark, please. So here's how we travel. And if we want, you can see the decline in use if we want to get back to something like 1952 when this diagram started. So if we move on again, I don't think we'll be able to rely on technology coming to save us. It may arrive and sort things out, or it may not. So we probably need to deploy the techniques we have now. And again, if you move on, we can see how a low car, low speed, short distance, low cost, high accessibility system can work in traditional towns, even those whose populations or functions define them as rural. Here we can cluster services in space to allow that to happen. Everyone can live close enough to what they need. However, rural areas are somewhat different. They are low density and distances are longer. Moving on again. So in some cases, villages cluster enough to support all the services that people need. So here, Hope in Derbyshire, we have a higher education college, 3 or 4 shops, number of cafes. It is in a tourist area, a pub, and it can just about support the station, which is quite a way away. But in some places, populations too dispersed, Mark. So here, there are no clusters. This is Connemara. There are no clusters of people together enough to be able to supply them with all the services they need within a short distance. Here, of course, many people will drive to big shops or towns further away, even though if we have our low traffic utopia, that may not be possible in the future. So you move on. So if we have people who live further away than 15 minutes, or if you read Morano's book, he suggests half an hour in rural areas, then we can't actually serve them in a sense conventionally, that you go to a service to find out what you need. What we can do, however, if we move on, is actually take the service to them. Now, this actually happens quite a lot in the past, Mark. So, for instance, actually, my milk still comes from a farm. My colleague Ted, who lives in North London, has a mobile shop. We used to have a mobile library, as we see here. And when I lived in Devon, when I was young, the doctor ran a surgery from the back of the chapel. So, and deliveries in rural areas were always done a long, long time before the invention of online shopping. Next. However, a delivery of beer by post from a brewery is not the same as going to a pub, and online education doesn't substitute for the social benefits of attending school. This is why education has to be in this ministry of place. In the past, we would have clustered functions in time. You would, living in a rural area, you'd have gone occasionally to the local market town, you'd have done your business, you'd have paid your bills, you'd have bought those things you couldn't make yourself or grow yourself, and you'd have come home again. Now, I think a lot of people wouldn't really fancy that in an age of instant gratification. But if we think about it, that I work from home, my partner works from home, she clusters her meetings. So she makes one trip to the area which she covers, and she'll do several meetings, and she'll try and arrange it so she can do it on the train rather than take the car. You can also cluster functions in space, Mark. So what you quite often find in rural areas is that one building, one operation will do a number of things. So the picture on the left, Talybont on Usk, that building is a cafe, a shop, a post office, and a cycle hire. It's been pointed out by my colleagues who reviewed this in 25 years' time, there may not be post offices, but let's not worry about that for now. Now, the interesting thing about the pub on the right is that it is locally owned, it's community owned. And this brings us to the idea of who is driving this, who owns it. And so we could have a top-down process of providing for things in rural areas. But if you look at, so the point about top-down is it really gets things done. But if you had top-down private, they would try and construct an extractive economy, and rural areas already have enough wealth taken out. I know a lot of people, rich people, live there, but for many people who live there, the wealth is leaving the area and heading to those places. So what we could always look at is the bottom right-hand box, Mark, where we're looking at smaller councils, parish councils, who are essentially local people rather than bought-in politicians, and the community as such. Now, there are plenty of examples of community businesses in deep rural areas, Mark. So if you happen to go to the Outer Hebrides, where the population is extremely thin on the ground, there are local shops which provide people with their needs and also clearly sell goodies to the tourists, Mark. And you can see at this slide, yes, that they offer quite a wide range of services, a wider range of services than your average shop would give. Now we're dealing with transport, and Mark, there are clearly examples of community-run minibuses. Now, okay, this is a party of villages heading off somewhere for a jolly, probably, but the chap who ran this was interested in data, Mark. And what he was trying to do was to integrate the supply of things with the demand for things. So he was thinking about using his bus between a small village and a local railway station, which is fine. It's used in the peak. But what about during the middle of the day? How can he use it during the middle of the day? And what he was actually interested in this sense was data, because he could get addresses of the season postcodes, at least of season ticket rail holders, and he could also get the postcodes of healthcare workers and where healthcare was needed. So he was trying to integrate supply and demand. Now, this is really about active travel, which I haven't properly mentioned yet, Mark. So here we have two people doing a bit of active traveling in the countryside. And again, move on, please. So if you can get to your secondary school in 15 minutes, all well and good. But otherwise, we need to extend the range of active travel. E-bikes help, but beyond the range of e-bikes, or the time, beyond the range of e-bikes, we need to think about integration with other forms of transport. So we understand walking to a bus stop, where it is possible in rural areas, which is not a lot of places. We understand walking to a railway station. However, we don't understand quite as much about cycling to a bus stop, and clearly here in Tytherington, in Buckinghamshire, they don't really understand it either, but we do understand cycling to a railway station. Now, what's important, and we provide for it, but what's important in a rural area is that you don't really want to leave your bike at the station or at the bus stop, because you might need it at the other end, Mark. And one of the problems with the sort of conventional operation is if you say you had the last train turns up and it's full of bikes, then you do need to still be able to get your bike on the train, because there may not be another train that day that you can use. So I think we've exceeded the 6 bike limit on this train, Mark. So anyway, so taking these ideas together, the person who's had the minibus idea was looking at a network of mobility hubs across the high peak, combining all those things there on the diagram. He didn't include toilets, which is obviously pretty important, and he could have added it to a shop or a pub or a cafe as a village hall. Next, please. And just an example, Talibant and Lusk again, they had something like this years ago based on cheap hydroelectricity that was community generated. They could run power cars, and then later they, so the cars are at the village hall, powered by locally generated electricity, and then later they moved to, following a report by us, they looked at what facilities they could provide for walkers and cyclists. Moving on. So I talked about integration. The other thing in all this is information. I expected somebody to have gone on about mobility as a service. So I wasn't going to talk about it, but there is a problem in rural areas of reception for things like that. And if you have a relatively limited service that you can effectively keep in your head, there's nothing wrong with paper information as long as it's up to date and you can find it. So to go to my last slide, I'd like to say that the themes that I've really talked about are that we should talk about integration rather than atomization. We should be thinking small, perhaps, so that we have an attention to local detail and local needs, but also there's no one fixed solution. That's it.
Thanks very much, Steve. I think there was definitely at least one question about active travel in rural areas in the Q&A that's been posted online during the presentations. So if I can bring all of our speakers back onto the screen, please, and then we can have an open discussion about some of the questions that that people have been posting and potentially that might still come in. So if I just go to some of the questions that came through, I'm sure some of you will be able to read a few of them, but not all of them. And the first one that we got from John was about embracing buses into active travel, and the idea that active travel focuses on walking, cycling, scooting, but actually if you're going to get a bus, there's a bit of active travel in every bus journey because you've got to walk to the stop. How does that link into planning for active travel if I'm getting a vision of an integrated utopian future? If I can start with you, Peter, and your utopian future. I'm not sure your AI had very many buses in it, but I'm sure there must have been some in there somewhere.
I wasn't sure if they were buses or trams. They were just very futuristic public transport. We'll just go with that. I'm going to do some refining of my AI skills. In terms of that question about incorporating bus into active travel, yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that it needs to be there. I mean, it doesn't get put in the envelope with walking, wheeling, and cycling, but I think the two things very much go hand in hand and have to go hand in hand for this utopian future scenario, which I don't think that needs to be I think that is just good planning. And unfortunately, for so long, active cycling in particular has kind of been almost pitted against buses. There's some issues around kind of bus stop bypasses when we're building cycle lanes, but actually the issue that we have here is because there's so much, and there's some comments in the chat about car constraint, and Tom touched on it. The issue that we have is that we're all fighting over finite space, and in this scenario I've described, then there's more space because you're constraining private motor vehicles. So you have your hierarchy where you have a nice pavement that is attractive for people to walk on, that isn't too narrow because it's been constrained because we need 3 lanes of motor vehicle traffic. You have a cycle lane, and then you provide for public transport, and then what is left is there for the private motor vehicle. So yeah, I absolutely think that bus has got a huge part to play. I think bus has often been neglected in transport planning. There seems to be more focus with these bus improvement plans at the moment, which is more your area, Catherine. But I absolutely believe that they need to be hand in hand and not pitted against each other, and kind of partnered together and integrated. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Tom, in your presentation, you focused on Milton Keynes and talked about the concept of designing it for being place centric, and then actually everybody drives. I have to admit, I don't know what the bus network is like in Milton Keynes, but I suspect with all of those grids, it's not actually very easy to get a useful bus service around.
I think you'd be right, and I do sympathise. I realise it was a little bit lazy of me to give Milton Keynes a kicking, but hey, it's easy, so why not? But in fact, I think Milton Keynes is genuinely an interesting case, given the context of today's session. Yes, I think the grid represents a serious impediment to delivering public transport, and whilst it's a while since I looked at it, I know that they were trying quite hard to find core corridors that they would serve with high-speed bus services, and there may be other people who can speak more authoritatively about that. But I will, seeing as you've invited me to speak, reiterate what's been said, and that is that active travel has to be seen as the perfect complement to collective transport. Whilst it may be assumed that we're talking about journeys that are door to door by cycle, walk, or wheel, that's only a proportion of travel. And there's no question that for the longer distances, we're absolutely going to have to combine those forms of transport with collective movement. Steve showed us some good examples of how we could get there, and it's a frustration that we don't yet in this country at least, allow cycles on buses in any significant way. That's something which has been cracked years ago in other countries, and it seems to me to be something which we really ought to fix, because whether we like it or not, the rail network is going to continue to be relatively sparse in this country. Buses have the potential to be a great deal more dense, and they are a great deal more flexible. So they really are going to continue to be the backbone of our collective transport system. So we really need to be catering for their combination with active travel so as to get the best of both.
And yes, Steve, coming to you, you did show some great examples of how bus might extend active travel into rural areas. What do you think is needed to make that a reality? Is it planning? Is it legislation? How can we make that more front and focus in the minds of people who are setting transport policy?
There is some stuff with legislation, because one of the reasons why bikes on buses is difficult here is that we're not allowed to hang them off the front, like say they do in the United States, where they're under the eye of the driver can see someone loading them. So the bikes have to go in the buses, so that makes it rather more complicated. So that we need something to do about legislation of where you can put bikes safely on buses. We also need to, when we specify bus services, we might need to start specifying that the bus can accommodate bikes, and which may need, again, rethought of how we design and build buses, in that one of the key things with, say, the ease of saying to putting a bicycle on a train, not the sort where you hang it up, is if, for instance, you've got a kiddie on the back, you load the bike and the kiddie at the same time, and you're not unloading the child and putting the child on and unloading the bike. Because certainly I remember when daughter was asleep, she could go on the train asleep and be got off while still asleep. But so there is the issue also that if you may need to take the luggage with the bike, you may, there's quite a lot of things that you may. So you can specify that, I think, in how if you specify attended bus service, what the bus is. I don't honestly know, and there are people close to planning we could say how you incorporate that into a planning policy. How so somebody else can answer that bit of the question.
I'm not sure that we've got anyone on the panel with that kind of background in policy. But Mariam, just wanted to come to you and perhaps link this into one of the other questions. In terms of cycling, you mentioned in your presentation that you're used to just cycling to work in the clothes you're going to work in, and somebody put in one of the questions that they are put off cycling to work because when they get there it requires a change of clothes and a shower. Is that experience that you've had of cycling to work and then just getting on with work in somewhere that's very flat? Because I know my local area does require quite a lot of effort as it's very hilly.
So I'm originally from the Netherlands, but I used to live for many, many years in Munich, in Germany, which is anything but flat. It's quite hilly because it's near the Alps. And I've cycled to work there, I think, and to university. I think the average journey was maybe 5-6 miles. And I've never had the feeling. It's the type of cycling as well. Obviously, if you want to go there as quickly as possible and you put all your effort in and you treat it like you're on a road race, where you reach there and you feel like you have to take a shower. But if you do a gentle, more like pootling along kind of journey to work, it might take you 10 minutes longer, but you arrive there and you don't have to change your clothes. I think it's also when you look at the bikes we have here in England, they're often really sporty. It's often road bikes that when you buy them, there's nothing much in it. People don't generally have kickstands or lights on it or racks or anything. Then they tend to wear backpacks, which again, it gives you a sweaty back, especially if you carry all your work stuff and your spare clothes with you. So I think having a more active travel friendly bike is also important, a bit more upright. When look at the Dutch bikes, they're not fast bikes, but they're made to be really, for everyday journeys. They have a pannier rack, they have often fixed panniers to it, they have a kickstand, they have lights built in. It's a different way of cycling, and I think that's that shift needs to be made if we want to have cycling more as an active travel. And then go out on the weekend and do your road racing. I mean, that's a different kind of cycling. So I think try and manage it slightly different depending on what type of cycling you're doing on the day.
Okay, thank you.
If I
Just
can
in terms,
come
sorry.
in. So
Yeah,
I
go
was
on.
going to comment on that as well. I think, just to reiterate, I think it is also kind of it's a symptom of what cycling is like in the majority of this country. I am that person who rides a road bike to work, and I ride defensively, and I ride quite fast because it's often quite unpleasant. If there was a nice, connected, safe network of cycle lanes for me to use, I would probably cycle in a bit more of a relaxed manner, and a softer pace, and therefore probably wouldn't need to change when I get there. That's a choice that I make. I like to ride a bit faster, and I have the facilities at my office to get changed. But I do think that that's a symptom of our network and of the type of cycling we have in this country. And the other part of that question I saw in the chat was about should workplaces be kind of mandated to provide facilities so that people can shower and change, and in this kind of ministry of place, that would absolutely be a requirement. And I think that's a really basic thing. I was working for Sustrans 10 plus years ago doing kind of workplace travel planning, where we were kind of pushing that, and there's still workplaces now in 2025 where isn't and it may not be possible in some workplaces, but that should absolutely be a requirement for a workplace, that you provide secure cycle parking, places for people to change, people to shower, drying facilities. Like if you get wet on the way to work, no matter what clothes you're in, that's quite unpleasant. So these are barriers that can be overcome, and e-bikes can overcome some of the hills and the sweatiness. So I don't think that's a barrier that we can't overcome, for sure.
I do think our weather doesn't help.
Absolutely.
So if we are, somebody's put in the question, if we're going to get to this utopia, will vision-led planning help us, or will it largely fail because it's not integrated, holistic enough, and there's not enough stick? So, Tom, perhaps I can come to you on that one first. Is there a way that we can use the idea of vision-led planning to get us to this idea that actually works?
I was hoping you'd give me this question, Catherine. Thank you. Well, I have to declare an interest because I've been a fan of vision-led planning, or terms to that effect, for a long time. I was involved in the original version of Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance, STAG, when it was written in the early ooze, I suppose it was. And we were then writing about setting objectives first and then considering what you might do following that and working out whether the potential intervention was actually achieve the objectives. It's now more commonly called vision-led planning, but it's only ever seemed to me to be common sense, as in define the future that you desire and then work out what might get you to that future and do those things. So I would defend vision-led planning to the end because it seems to me to be the only form of planning that makes much sense. And I realize that there are plenty of people who disagree with that, but that's my opening position. As for whether it contains enough stick, I can't see anything about vision-led planning which excludes stick. For example, if we were to say that the vision is to get to a low carbon transport system, seems to me to be a sensible vision, then it seems inevitable that stick is going to be a large part of what we end up doing. And that goes back to my closing remarks during my presentation. So I'm a fan of it, and I don't see anything else getting us to the required destination any quicker, certainly.
So we do need that ministry then?
Well, now, yeah, I suppose in principle, I think the idea of integrated planning is highly desirable, and I would not be the first person to say that our failure to integrate transport and land use planning is one of our great regrets, really, as in it has led us to all sorts of very, very unhelpful situations in our cities and elsewhere. Whether that's enough is a different matter. Integrated planning doesn't necessarily mean that the organizations delivering are following what I would call vision-led planning. They could simply be choosing the things that they preferred or repeating the mistakes of the past. And I suppose it's inevitable that one would mention the Department of Environment, Transport and the Regions, as was in the days of the Blair government, which was an experiment that I think was widely seen to fail. And that was why we ended up with a separate Department for Transport a couple of years later. So in principle, it's a really nice idea. In practice, it seems something that we're not very good at doing, at least given the way we do government in this country.
And potentially, it could be the way we do government in this country, because I've been involved in other other webinars that are talking about vision place planning, and there seems to be some very good examples from Europe that do make this a success, but have started perhaps from a slightly different position. And I think there's been some discussion in the chat and in some of the questions about starting this 25 years ago to get to where you want to go. And maybe that's the problem, that it's going to take that long to get us where we need to be, but we've got to start somewhere. And Peter, you mentioned that in your presentation in terms of, we're not going to get this tomorrow, are we? And there definitely was a question about how long this might take. And I don't know, Steve, if the work you've been doing, if you've got a view on how long it takes to turn around years of doing it differently.
I don't know, but what I have done a bit of work on is the fact that you can do change, but it puts quite a lot of effort in. I had a look at how much cycling was the growth. Sorry, I had a look at growth in cycling under various sort of schemes. So City London is the current hot piece of information that cycling is growing, car traffic is going down. Well, if you put that on top of, let's say, at the time it started, the whole country grew at that rate. Well, we'd be back to the sort of cycling levels that we were enjoying, say, just after the war during petrol rationing. And the same was true for the Wilmslow Road scheme in Manchester. I could do it for more schemes, but there's very little, loads of timeline data. So it's very easy to turn things round as long as you have vision, as long as you have quite a bit of money and people wanting to behind you to actually achieve it. But those two things I talked about are only two places in a large country.
Okay, thank you. We have had a question in. I think I'd like to ask Mariam to talk about. One of the questions we had in is, how do we reconcile productivity as a drive towards more and better active travel options with the fact that most of the marginalised, those most marginalised and excluded from taking part, might not be able to opt into government schemes? So those that without the capacity to walk, or those barred from taking employment, either temporarily or otherwise, such as refugees and newly arrived people. So, we are talking about, getting people to work by active travel, but actually there's a whole section of the community that can't work for a number of reasons. So how do we get them involved in active travel, and what can be the drivers for getting them to think about active travel?
I think it's a lot of schemes like we put on with the training and stuff, but then there are also schemes, for example, the Bike Project, which is providing bikes for refugees for free, and also ongoing support. They're doing their own cycle lessons. They're giving them full kit with lights and locks and everything. They repair the bikes if they have any issues. So there's schemes in place, but it's very little for a large a community out there. So it's not enough. I think what the schemes are there. What it needs is a lot more support from government, financial support, but also schemes like the Cycle to Work scheme, which is only accessible if you are employed and if you are on a certain level of income. So I think that needs to change in looking into, because people have to get to places and they do spend money on it, unless they're only doing hyper local walkable journeys. They spend money on bus journeys, on car travel, on other public transport options, and it all costs money. So they have a little bit of income they could spend on schemes, but it needs to be made accessible for people on low income or on benefits, And I think we just need to spread this out further. Sustrans actually published recently a report about a bike voucher scheme to make bikes accessible for people who are on benefits. And I think something like that needs to be made wider accessible, and probably also looking more at schemes for people who need adapted bikes or cargo bikes, especially families with young children. Cargo bikes is the only way to get around if you want to get children on a bike, young children on a bike. Very expensive, unfortunately, and even within working families, often out of range, because storage is another issue with that. Pedal My Wheels and Wheels for Wellbeing came up with a recent scheme where people can loan an adapted bike for 4 weeks and use that one. But it's often those schemes are time limited, which is difficult. But yeah, I think there are schemes there. They need to be wider accessible and they need to get more support. But I also find, and we found that at Joyriders, that if we often give out free bikes to people as well when someone is really in need and they can't access any other scheme, is that we make them pay a little bit, even if it's just £20 or so, because it kind of creates that ownership. You know, I've bought it, I've done something for it, and that's really quite important. So yeah, we need to work on schemes and we need to improve them and needs to make sure that that's accessible, and that needs to be paired up with training. Training is really important, and the bike storage part. So those things are the things that needs to come together to get people cycling. And if we have those three not aligned, then people won't cycle. And a lot of support in, you know, just talking to people and encouraging them.
Thank you, Mariam. Peter, if people aren't traveling to work by active travel because they either can't or they don't travel to work, how do we encourage them to think about active travel for other purposes?
Yeah, I was hoping I'll be able to come in on this a little bit, because a lot of what we've been doing in transport planning in relation to cycling in particular over the last 10 years or so is very much focused on the commute to work. We use census data. This propensity to cycle tool kind of is looking at journeys to work, but journeys to work, well, as the original question asks, it kind of excludes quite a lot of people. And actually, if you think about the journeys that you make in a week, yes, of course, commuting is one of them. It may be now less following the pandemic and the kind of advent of working from home. But what about the journey to school and to education, to family and friends, all of these leisure journeys that are probably traditionally in the majority of the country are probably driven and by this kind of so I talked about productivity, and obviously growth and inclusive growth is a real buzzword and really important thing at the moment. But actually, when we're looking at this more holistically, how many journeys that are clogging it? Like Saturday, I live in Birmingham. Saturday going into Birmingham city centre is clogged to high heaven with cars. Everyone drives there, even though it's got a decent public transport system. Why is that? Like, why is nobody cycling into Birmingham city centre? Well, because from what I've just described, it's not particularly safe in most circumstances. So yeah, I think there's of course we need to focus on productivity and getting people to work. That's obviously key, but we also need to get people to other destinations and not get too hung up on commuting and those kind of other journeys that are important. And how do we get people to walk and cycle to those? Like the point that Mariam made, or the original poster about kind of refugees. So I've just been doing a project in South Yorkshire, and we want the cycling strategy that they're putting potentially out to be not just focused on cycling to work. So we're looking at case studies, and we had a refugee who'd come over and he'd hired a bike. He wasn't working yet, he wasn't able to work yet, but that bike had enabled him to integrate into the local community, to explore this new town that he'd arrived in. He had no idea about the town, and it actually helped him to meet people. So then you're looking at active travel as a tool for your well-being. He may not be productive, he's not working yet, but it's giving him a tool to actually integrate into our community. And therefore, if he improves his mental and physical well-being, maybe he's going to not have an opposite effect in terms of needing to use the NHS, etc., because he's active and he's happy, and that is leading into kind of productivity in another sense of the word, and not just a kind of economic sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, and I think there's, there are studies that have been done, but it's quite hard to quantify the savings that can be made from other services because somebody is healthier, they've got a better integration into their society, they're meeting people so that their mental well-being is better, they can get to green spaces. That's really hard to quantify the benefit in terms of savings elsewhere for that kind of, but we know it's good. We know it's good for people to get out, to meet people, to go to green spaces and be active, just very hard to quantify it. And Steve, I wanted to come to a picture you showed in your presentation of a school child cycling in a very rural area. And one of the things that struck me about that is, whether that as a society now, we are slightly more risk averse in terms of allowing people to take to a bike and cycle in places where, they aren't on a segregated space. So there could be danger. I know that friends of mine that have children like, oh no, I wouldn't let them do that on their own. Thinking, I'm sure we did when we were young. Do you think that is a barrier that's grown over the last 50 years in terms of people having a different attitude to cycling, and obviously because there's more cars on the road?
That's quite interesting because I could have the other slide was my daughter's coming home from primary school. What was interesting was when they left the primary school, they walked on a pavement of a B road, and then they went up a lane which had very little traffic. And our worries were clearly they wanted to walk home on their own, even at primary school age, because that's what big kids do. Our worry was the pavement alongside the B road, whereas when they wanted to bring friends home, their friends' parents were not worried about the pavement along the B road. They were worried about the lane without any houses on it. And so, yes, there are people who are worried about open spaces. There are people who are worried, to my mind, about the wrong thing. But certainly, I would say that, well, actually, there's bags and bags of information, data that kids don't travel like they used to. There is a slide that's knocking around of child in Sheffield, the grandparents would go 6 miles to fish in a pond, and the current child only goes like 100 yards down to the end of the road maximum. And so there is a way we are closing down people's opportunities to travel under their own power, or indeed walk to the bus stop and get the bus somewhere. When I was young, I was certainly allowed to get into Plymouth, which was the nearest big town, on the bus and get a train somewhere. Whereas I'd let my kids do that, but when they were younger. But I think there's a lot of feeling that kids are getting just carted around and they don't learn how to travel, as well as their parents are closing their world down for them.
Thank you. And Tom, in your presentation about Milton Keynes, you said that there are cycleways, lots of cycleways. You showed us that map with all the red lines on it, but you said that they weren't necessarily particularly attractive to use. And Peter, you've said, I think twice now, it's not easy cycling into Birmingham. So is that one of the keys for active travel? And Mariam, you work in an inner city area quite often if you're in London, where I'm sure there's a shared space issue with trying to get people on bikes if cycling is a battle against the traffic that we have on the roads now, as potentially there wasn't that much traffic 50 years ago. So yeah, Mariam, if I can come to you about your experience of cycling, of getting people to feel comfortable cycling in a busy area.
I think in London, London is very varied. We have lots of boroughs, and it really depends a bit on which borough you are. But especially East London, Northeast London, we have a lot of cycleways and cycle lanes, and cycling can be quite nice, but it's knowing them, which is the problem. So when you travel in the car, or when you go by bus or any other form of public transport, you usually get to know the main roads. And if you think about cycling, that's where you think about cycling on. But rather the cycling network is a bit hidden away. It's quieter roads and go through low traffic neighborhoods and stuff. So you can get around quite nicely in some parts of London without having to worry much about competing with cars. And then there are other bits which are really quite horrible. And the worst thing is actually when you have horrible bits in between the nice bits, because that often stops people to cycle because they have to overcome that little bit of horrible cycle lanes. So it's kind of a bit hit and miss in London. It's very varied in different boroughs and in different areas. So where some are really good, others are not. And so what we do a lot of bike rides where we take people with us on rides and we cycle with them along the cycle network in London, so they get to know that. And they're often quite surprised. They're like, oh, well, I never knew that this was here, or how easy it is to get to this place. So there's certainly a bit of a surprise element. And then we have groups in parts of London which are not so nice, and they certainly have to overcome more challenges with more traffic and bigger roads. But it's also about showing people, where to position yourselves so that, you're less at risk of being hit by a car or van. And often when accidents happen, it's often linked to that cyclists being in places where they're invisible. So being visible is really important, and being in a position where you feel safe and where you have your own space when you cycle on busy roads. But there still needs to be a lot more work done in London, definitely. And I think there needs to be a big funding push for a cycling network, which then also, again, takes into consideration things like bus stops, because I know that's a big debate in London. We have floating bus stops and other things. So yeah, it's very varied wherever you go.
And Peter, so do you think that one of the problems is this lack of awareness of where there are cycle lanes? I mean, I know there's some new cycle lanes coming into Birmingham that I have not used because I don't live in that area, but they look great. But do people know about them?
I think there's an element of that, but I think what we're lacking is a joined up network, and you're beginning to see that in London, as Mariam's described, and in Birmingham I can tell you about 2 or 3 kind of cycle superhighways, but getting to them and off them, like the Blue Route, which is the famous one in Birmingham, just dumps you out in the city centre or at the other end, and there's no provision, and it only takes one junction or one near miss to potentially put somebody off who is less confident, who isn't kind of an acolyte of cycling like myself, if you want to call myself, who's been doing it for 10 years and kind of takes the rough with the smooth. And I'm not the target audience for this network. I'm doing it anyway. What we're trying to target is what I've always described as kind of the maybe cyclists, the person who might think about this, but they need the network. So while I think wayfinding and awareness is important, you have to have the network there first. And absolutely, you can have quiet ways and low traffic neighborhoods provide that kind of provision alongside your super highways. But in most cities outside London, well, and as Mariam's touched upon, large swathes of London, that simply isn't there. So to use a kind of lived example, my wife works across the 4 hospitals in Birmingham. There is just about a safe route to the Queen Elizabeth, the one big hospital in Selly Oak. But I would, even if she wanted to, I would discourage her and would absolutely say, don't do it, to cycle to the other one, which is in the east of the city. And I wouldn't cycle there. There is no provision. The roads are busy and it is dangerous. So there straight away, it's cyclable distance, but there's just no safe way to get there. So I think the network being there and it being safe and attractive from your door is the key. And that's kind of what I was talking about in my presentation, that until you can step out your door and it's safe, then you may still go to the car and it won't become the first choice. As I said, only one junction or one fast road is a big barrier, and if that's enough to stop you making the journey, full stop. And same with walking. If there's a lack of crossing, if the school that your kids go to is half a mile away, but to get there, there's a dual carriageway with no crossing. You're probably not going to do it because it's not safe and you're not going to risk your child. Or if there's a subway that's not safe at night or is unpleasant, these are all huge barriers. So I've talked a lot about cycling, but the same things apply to walking as well.
Thank you. So it feels like, coming back to your kind of idea of the ministry or not, Tom, that we've got there's quite this. It feels like there's quite a long way to go to enable us in the UK to look to a future where we get this right, and we aren't just putting cycle lanes in alongside busy roads that make them unpleasant, and we're not necessarily linking the cycle or the active travel lanes. Sorry, yeah, you're right. It's not just cycling; it's walking and scooting and everything else as well. So where do we start in terms of getting on this journey of making it work, rather than doing something that looks like it should work on a map but doesn't actually work in practice?
Well, I think we could certainly start by recognizing that progress is being made and there's some great infrastructure being put in. And I think big up Active Travel England for leading the charge and some of the authorities that are doing really exemplary work. So it's not as if it's all bad, but we've got a very, very long way to go. But I think the other thing is that, as we've said in various ways already during this meeting, simply providing good infrastructure isn't going to be enough. In order for people to change their behavior, we actually need to give them good reason to stop using their cars. And that, I suppose, brings us back to this idea of car constraint and where it comes from. And maybe that helpfully links to something that you posed just after we'd all spoken, actually, Catherine, which is about whether we're putting the cart before the horse. I'm now going to quote the former vice mayor, I think, of Ghent, whose name I'm now going to mangle, Philip Vatu, I think is his name. He was accused during the run-up to the major changes that they put in Ghent of putting the cart before the horse. You have to improve the circumstances for alternatives to the car before you can start taking away people's right to drive. Forgive me, I'm going to use an expletive. He described that as bollocks. His view was that the minute that you put in the constraints to car, you have, at a stroke, improved the environment for every other form of travel. And he's got a good point. And we've got people on the call who've been to Ghent recently and have been saying nice things about it. It's a pleasure to be there. And it is a sort of mecca for active travel and for public transport. It's not perfect, nowhere is, but it's a good example for us to consider and perhaps try to replicate. It takes a huge amount of political courage, which tends to be somewhat lacking in this fine country of ours.
Thank you. That's probably a very good place to end this discussion. So we need the political will, and maybe we do need those car constraints first. Thank you all very much for your contributions today. It's been a really interesting discussion, and one that no doubt will continue offline and in webinars and conferences to come, because it does feel like we have a way to go before we actually get the will and the constraints to make this happen. But it's been really interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine. Cheers.